This is a response to Noelplum99 and a video called something about science, chimpanzees, snakes, that whole thing. It's a series of questions anyway there, Noel, about is it okay to pull the legs off chimpanzees, kind of. I don't want to go there, but the first bit of it where you're talking about, well, I think you're talking about kind of original sin, or you're talking about the experience in the Garden of Eden, that myth where Adam and Eve are tempted by the snake to eat of the tree of good and evil, knowledge of good and evil, as a result of which they're cast out of the garden, and by an angry God, and the snake is cursed to crawl on its belly forever. And not only are they, the pair on the ground, cursed, their future generations are cursed. So the original sin goes with them and is visited upon their let this train go past. The curse of the angry God, as I say, isn't just visited upon them, it's visited upon all their descendants. And presumably the same applies to the snake. It's not just the snake which is cursed for being so naughty, but all the descendant snakes are also cursed. Virgin train. Come on, pups. So it's that bit really I'm interested in the story, because that's the bit which is often unfair, isn't it, or is often thought of as being unfair. But there's this tyrannical God, this authoritarian parent, who's so cross because he's been disobeyed that he just throws a wobbler and kicks his kids out of the playroom and takes all their toys away. And not just that, but as I say, the curse goes down the generations right through to Jesus and beyond, perhaps, and similarly with the snake. But I think there's an interpretation of that which I quite like, as an allegory, which works better for me. I think it works better if, instead of the idea of this removal from the garden and the crawling on your belly bit, instead of those being curses or punishments, if they're seen as consequences. And for them to be seen as consequences, you have to redefine God a wee bit. So instead of being this authoritarian parent, lawgiver kind of character, it's more like Kronos, the god of time, or the personification of time. So what I think you get when you put that in the mix is you get time enacting consequences upon certain actions in history. So I'm kind of imagining this moment in the Pliocene, or probably a bit further back than that, a bit like that moment at the beginning of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which I've talked about before recently. Bunch of primates out there in the, in the Great Rift Valley somewhere, messing about with some stuff. And then something happens. It doesn't really matter whether it's a big slab of steel like the Sentinel in 2001, or whether it's a tree with a particularly attractive looking fruit on it. Something is there, and a primate, one of these primates, just happens to make this interesting little move. He's got a tiny amount more cognitive connections than his mates and the rest of his family. Tiny little mutation in one of his genes, which has just given him this little bit of a cognitive advantage, where he can, maybe tear a branch off the tree and use it as a weapon, or maybe he can climb to the top of the tree, or maybe he can use some kind of tool to be able to access the tree better, a stick to knock the apples down, something like that, that gives him a bit of a cognitive advantage. But that small cognitive advantage, that little tweak of the genome, has consequences. That little bit of fruit of the tree of knowledge that he's kind of accumulated there has massive consequences downstream. It's that tiny moment. It's that tiny moment which, over generations and generations and generations and thousands of years, lead to the development of modern human consciousness, of Homo erectus and Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis and all those homos, and the gradual increase in size and ballooning of this forebrain that we've got, which is the unique signifier, so we say, of the human animal, with all that goes with it, you know what I mean, good and bad, because it's this massive forebrain that's allowed us to step outside of the cycle of nature, step outside of the routines that nature has to go through, the relatively static behaviours of nature, to step outside of those and engage in symbolic activity, engage in representational activity, develop things like science and art and philosophy and all these kind of knowledge sharing practices that we've got, technology. Step outside of nature. That's what's been the result of that. That's been the consequence of that. And so Kronos, the god of time, has in effect pushed us outside of the garden of nature and forced us to live by the sweat of our forebrains, which comes with as a curse, you know what I mean? Because that's not just the origin of consciousness, it's also the origin of the idea of sin. It may not be an original sin itself, but it's the origins of the idea of sin. Animals live in a state of innocence, don't they? Ignorant innocence. You need a forebrain, you need consciousness, you need the possibility of planning, you need different kinds of judgments to be in place before you can have the idea of sin. And so we get that there as well. And we can never go back. Once you're out the garden, there's no going back. And of course the same is true for the snake. Snakes apparently evolved from animals that had little limbs, front and back, lizards. And the consequences have been enacted not just on that particular snake, but the consequences of time are still being visited upon the snake. Not really a curse. They've adapted very well, just like we've adapted reasonably well to our ballooning forebrains. But yeah, they still crawl on their bellies and we still live by the sweat of our brows.